Okay, this is Cosmic Dance Talk, all about death and dying, by special request of Emma Brown. And it's such a riveting subject, because dying is something which is going to happen to absolutely every one of us. And it could happen at any moment. And life, in my experience, just goes so quickly, because one minute you're 17, and then the next minute you're suddenly 60. You think, how did that happen? It flies so quickly. And I'm surprised, but in a way it's such a taboo subject. In Victorian times it wasn't a taboo subject. Death was very sort of out in the open, and it was sex which was the taboo subject. But now it's sort of swapped over, and sex is all out in the open, and death has been covered over as the taboo subject. But in some cultures, like in the Tibetan Buddhist culture, death is very much it's very much in the day-to-day. It's very much in all the art and all the imagery, and all their art has skeletons and entrails and everything. So it's all reminding you of the impermanence of life on the line of time. The way I'm going to do this is a bit how we did the last talk, which was on free will and the blueprint. And I sort of did a run through first of going a tip from my own experience. So I'll do that again this time, and I'll try and explain why it's always so fascinated me, the idea of what happens at death and what it's all about. And for me, I think it first started because when I was 5, my father was diagnosed with throat cancer, and because my mother was a nurse, she nursed him at home. So he took about 4 years to die, but he died at home. So he died when I was 9, and that experience got me wondering at a very early age where he'd gone and what happens at death. So it sort of set off this search of trying to understand it all. And then, as a result of that experience, when I was 14, I wrote a poem called Death is Birth, which again was about death. And it got into the school magazine, and my mother was showing it to some friends of hers, and then they showed it to Dr. Rolls, who was the leader of Collett House back then, and the Sheikh. And then he sent me a book he'd written called Waking Up. So again, the whole of my Collett experience and connection again came out of my interest in dying. And then in about 1978 it was Dr. Rolls did some amazingly lovely meetings on dying. And it was just at the time that Raymond Moody's books were published. And Raymond Moody was still around. He's a doctor in America, and he was the person who first coined the term near-death experience. And it was basically because of the advances in science and the advances in resuscitation techniques, particularly with cardiac arrest, that more and more people were being resuscitated, and more people were relaying these experiences that they'd had, which we'll go into in a bit more detail in a minute. And they were such amazing meetings he did, and it was such a new subject, because now near-death experience is quite common, and you can find so many on YouTube. But back then it was sort of like a revelation, and for him it connected in with his own experiences of dying that he'd had himself. So it connected in with that. And then I knew an old lady who lived in Molesey, where I grew up, who was a nurse, and she told me about an experience she'd had when she was nursing a terminally ill patient. And she was sitting with the patient, and she said at a certain point it was like the wall of the room dissolved, and an angel came in, and then Jesus came in holding a chalice, and they just hovered over the patient, and then the whole vision disappeared, and the lady looked, and it was the moment at which the patient had died. So I'd heard several accounts of that. And then I think the next thing was when Dr. Rolls himself died, or even just before that. It was when his wife, Mrs. Rolls, died, and Dr. Rolls told me about her dying process, and about how once he called her back when she was unconscious, and she said to him, "Why did you call me back? It was so lovely where I was." And then she died, and then probably about 6 or 7 months later Dr. Rolls died, and it was very vivid, because I'd always sort of wondered with Dr. Rolls, what will it be like when he dies? And it was amazing, because I was here, and it was a graduation macabre for some new chickpeas. And it was back in the days when we used to have a training in the morning. And I turned in the morning in the macabre. It was probably one of the worst, most difficult macables I've ever done in my whole life. It was one where you sort of completely lose your pillar, and you're just sort of staggering around the room, longing for it to end. And then again, I knew I was turning in the evening in the graduation one. And I was absolutely terrified of going through the same experience with a huge, great audience. And I knew Dr. Rolls had he'd had a heart attack, and he was at home unconscious. And that macabre was just, I can't describe it. It was like the whole room became solid love, is the only way I can describe it. And to me, it felt like Dr. Rolls was just everywhere. It was like he was all around. And a friend of mine, Sue Cassini, asked me before the macabre, "Is Dr. Rolls still alive?" And I said, "I think he is, because I think we'd know if he'd died." And then, by the end of the ceremony, I said to Sue, "I think he could have died, because it was like his great force had sort of gone outwards somehow, it had been released." And he died that night. And I've known that several other times in macabres, after a very devoted dervish had died. The same thing happened again. There was another turner called Pam Varley, who was she was an absolute sort of model turner, her technique and her form. And she was a Samson Bashi and a turning teacher. And the day she died, the macabre again was another one like the Dr. Rolls one. There was just something filled the room, which I can't quite describe. And then there have been various other occasions where I've had friends who have died, and there was one occasion, there was an actress called Yearland who used to come here, and she developed a brain tumour, and I used to go and visit her. So I used to drive up from Dorset and call in and have tea with her. She lived in Hampton, and always when I left her, we felt this great sort of emotion. It was like, I suppose it was just very sattvic. There was a lot of sort of love. And then I visited her in her hospice when she was dying and drifting in and out of consciousness. And then about a week later, I was down in Dorset in my studio, and it was like something blew. I think describe it as like a sort of wind. It was like something blew into the room, and I knew it was her. And I spoke to her. It was like we had this dialogue, and then Helen was in the kitchen. I went and said to her, "I think Yearland has just died." And then in the evening, I rang up the hospice, and she had died that morning. So it was what it felt like. It felt like she was visiting all the people she had been emotionally connected with before going on to whatever came next. And there have been a number of occasions like that. And there's also been a number of occasions where it's like when there's someone you're very emotionally attached to, it's like they never really disappear, and often it's almost like they appear at times of need. And I had that on a number of times with Dr. Rolls after he died, over the ensuing few years. There was one very powerful occasion about a week after he died, when I was staying in his house looking after it, and it was my birthday. And when I woke up the next morning, it was like I knew something which I didn't know the night before. And the way I saw it, it was like a visual symbol almost. It was like what I was and what everyone was this huge, great, immense light. And on the top of this light, there were these little sort of flimsy bits of fabric, and all the light was sort of radiating out from this vastness. And if you identified with the little bits of fabric, it was possible not to notice the light. But what you were, and what everyone was that light. And I saw that so clearly when I woke up. It was like a great sort of visual image. I didn't dream it. It was almost like it had just appeared from somewhere. And then I had another. There were quite a lot of different Dr. Rolls ones, which I won't go into. But then I had another very significant one here once. It was about 5 years after my mother had died. And I was sleeping up here. Again, it was another turning training. I was sleeping in the study, and it was when we used to train people in the morning. And it was the night before one of my major life traumas. And I didn't know it was a major life trauma was coming the next morning. But as I was up there, I just closed my eyes, and suddenly my mother appeared, again as a visual image. And it was so clear, and I felt her fragrance. And I opened my eyes and I said to myself, what on earth was that about? And then when the next day happened, I suddenly knew what it was about. It was like she had just appeared as a presence to reassure me that everything would be okay. And everything was okay, although it was very traumatic for some time. So that's just giving a sort of run-in at some of my own experiences of it. And there's a number of different books. As I mentioned, there's the Life After Life books, and I imagine they're still available. And then our own Peter Fennec, who's the current chairman of our management committee, has written 2 books. One is The Art of Dying, which is a really beautiful book, and the other one is called The Truth in the Light. The Truth in the Light is it's an earlier book, and it's mostly different accounts of people's near-death experiences. And during the 1980s, Peter Fennec and I used to meet up about once or twice a month and have supper and write papers together. And it was just after he'd done some television and radio programs on dying, and all sorts of people all over the country had written in to him and sent in their accounts, and I had the chance to read through a lot of them, which were truly amazing and very moving. So that's a really lovely book, and so is his other one. And this one, which I'm just reading at the moment, is Dr. Penny Sartori, who is a doctor, and she was a nurse originally, and she again had just started coming across near-death experiences with her patients, so she decided to research them. And I think Peter Fennec became her tutor for her PhD, so she's rather like a Peter Fennec pupil. And then there's this really lovely one by Anita Mujani, and that's quite a popular one, and she's on the internet quite a lot on YouTube. And her case was, she was very terminally ill with cancer. She wasn't expected to live through the night. She was so terminal. But then she had a near-death experience, and in the experience she was shown what the cause of her cancer was, and she was given a choice, as they often are, on whether to come back or whether to go on. And in making the choice to come back, she was told that she would be healed, and she came back. She had the near-death experience, and then amazingly all her cancer just completely disappeared, which completely baffled everyone. So she's still around and lecturing. And this one here is another very popular one called Proof of Heaven by Dr. Ibn Alexander. And the nice thing about him is he's a neurosurgeon, and he again had a very major near-death experience. And being a neurosurgeon, he was able to look at it from a neurosurgeon's point of view. So as a brain scientist, he knew what was possible and what the brain was meant to do. So that's another really deep experience. And I'll go into that in a bit more depth, because the way he explains it relates so much to this model of 4 levels. And a lot of the whole sort of question of dying is bound up with the big question of who am I? And reading his experience, it's almost like the dying process is a spectrum, because what we were discussing, Emma, is the big question is often in the near-death experiences, people often still have a separate identity, because they're often meeting their relatives and looking down on their body, and yet you're also a total unity of the whole thing. So it's that whole question of where does individuality start and end. And in Dr. Alexander's experience, he goes in and out of being separate and experiencing other people in a separate universe in the out-of-body state. But then as he goes deeper into the state, it's like the separateness disappears, and he starts to see that everything exists within him, that there's not an outside world, but the whole manifest universe and everything in it is part of him, is him. And then he comes back again. It's like he then goes back through the spectrum again into separateness. So it's almost like there's a sort of ebb and flow where you find your place on the spectrum of consciousness or the spectrum of identity. And again, with this lady, with Anita Majani, in her near-death experience, it's like you're no longer bound by the normal confines of time and space. So she was simultaneously aware of all her relatives in different parts of the world and what they were thinking, and those who were sort of on their way to her deathbed. I think her brother was up in an aeroplane at the time. And it's like you're simultaneously everyone. You're both at the same time, you're aware of them, so at one level you're separate, and at another level they're all part of you. So it's the theory which is emerging out of all of these is very much in keeping with what we've been studying with non-dualism and the one consciousness, is that it's much more like the mind-body is just a vehicle for consciousness, the brain is just a vehicle for something which is universal. And when there's a letting go of the limitations, or the confines, you might say, of limiting consciousness just to a brain and a body, then the experience of it is much more universal. So it's like each person is just a vehicle for something that is universal and everywhere. And when there's a shedding of that, when the body falls away, as bodies do, then there's this amazing expansion goes on when you start to, it's like, I think, in Advaita it's described as, it's like a bottle in the Ganges, and when you're separate in your mind-body vehicle, then it's like you're a bottle, you're the water in the bottle. Then at death it's like the bottle breaks and the water merges back into the whole Ganges. Just a bit about the actual process of dying. Peter Fennec's very good in his Art of Dying book on the different stages of the dying process. And often people have intimations of death is one of the first things. And that often happens a couple of weeks beforehand. People suddenly get this feeling that it's their time. And I know, again, my mother had that. One day she suddenly took me upstairs and showed me where all her papers were in case I needed them. So it's like they could be perfectly healthy. Even people who die in car crashes or plane crashes often have that knowledge or intimation that they're not going to be here. So often that's about 2 weeks before death that's recorded. And then the next phenomena, which I really love, is what's known as deathbed visitors. And it's very frequently reported that the dying person who's in bed in the hospital or the hospice starts to see deceased relatives around the bed. Normally they start off at quite a distance, so at first you'll sort of see them out the window and just out the door, but as death gets nearer, the visitors come nearer into the room, and they're usually reported as ending up sort of sitting on the bed with the patient. And very occasionally other people see them as well, not only just the dying person. And often the dying person has a dialogue with the visitors, and so the real live visitors will be visiting, and the dying person will be busy talking to one of their deceased relatives. And often the relative says to the person, "I'm going to come back and collect you at a particular time." And the terminally ill patient often tells the nurses, "You won't need to look after me after tomorrow at 5 o'clock because I won't be here anymore." And sure enough, always the moment at which they die. And another thing in that process is what's known as the alternate reality, because often the dying person is almost like they're living in two worlds. They're drifting, partly they're in this world and they're with their live relatives, and then they disappear into this other reality. And that's very like the one that Dr. Rolls described, where Mrs. Rolls said, "Why did you bring me back? It was so lovely where I was." And then I remember another one. There was a caretaker here called Roy Tomlinson, and when he was dying, he again used to go into this alternate reality, and he came back and said that the music there is absolutely amazing. He said Mozart is only just the beginning. So that I find really amazingly interesting. And then the actual dying process, is most of you are familiar with, is very often the person finds themselves outside their body, looking down on their body. Often the medical staff are sort of running around trying to resuscitate them, and the dying person is in this very peaceful place and very dispassionately looking down on what's going on. And often, as I mentioned with Anita and others, they have this great multi-dimensional vision where they can see all their friends and relatives in all sorts of different places. So it's like the separation has disappeared. And then very often there's a dark tunnel is reported. So they find themselves, sometimes they're being helped down a dark tunnel, and it's almost like they're being guided down the dark tunnel. And usually there's a very strong light at the end of the tunnel. And another friend of ours, who is a turner, is Tony Anholt, who some of you knew. And he again was terminally ill with a brain tumour. And he actually went down the tunnel. And another one of our friends, who's an actor called Brian Blessed, who's got a great big boomy voice, he went to visit Tony, and Tony hadn't said goodbye to his son properly. And Tony, Brian Blessed boomed, "Come back, Tony." And apparently Tony heard this going down the dark tunnel, and he came back, and he was in a coma, and then he came out of the coma, and he was able to say goodbye to his son. So often with coma, it's often that there's just a slight bit of unfinished business, or there's people the dying person hasn't said goodbye to yet. In the reported cases, which are many, at the end of the tunnel is this great light, which most people describe as a being of light. And the being of light is so overwhelming, and it's like this amazing love flows off it. So it's like there's this love like what you've never experienced before. And often at the same time as that, there's reported the life review. So it's like you see all the events in your life like a sort of series of slides or a high-speed movie. You see all the different things that have happened, and you see it almost from a sort of dispassionate, like you're looking at it, your life from a different point of view. And sometimes you experience how the other people felt that you were relating to. So if you were very nasty to someone, you might feel the unhappiness of the person you were being nasty to. And if you were very kind to someone, then you'll feel the kindness that that person you were being nice to, the happiness they experience. But the being of light, while this is going on, it's only your sense of separateness that judges it. So when you look at how you've behaved, you think, oh dear, I shouldn't have done that. Whereas the being of light, it's just impartial love, so there's absolutely no judgment, no condemnation. So it's almost like the being of light at one level is your true self, it's who you really are, because all the time your true self is witnessing what goes on without any judgment. And very often the dying person is met by deceased relatives, so it's almost like they're there to help you over the barrier. And very often, I'm really pleased about this one, is all the pets you've had during your life are often there to meet you as well. So all the dogs and guinea pigs you had when you were a child. So it's like there's this great welcoming committee. And it's slightly different in different cultures, but often in the Western culture it's like you find yourself in this lovely meadow by a river or somewhere and your relatives are there. And often you come up against some sort of barrier. So often it's like a wicker fence or a nice privet hedge. And the dying person knows that if they go beyond that barrier, then that's it, they're dead, so they're not going to come back. But usually, because all these accounts are from people who have been resuscitated, they do come back. So normally one of the relatives will say to them, it's not yet your time, you're not meant to be here, you've got more work to do, you've got to go back. And then the dying person suddenly finds themselves back in their bodies, being resuscitated, and they're back in life again. So that's really the main sort of process of dying as we've learnt it from the near-death experience. Of course it's only near-death because no one's actually come back from full death to tell us what it's like. The other thing is when people come back, it's often like they've often got sometimes it's something like intuition or even psychic ability. They have powers and talents that they didn't have before the experience. So some people have the ability to know what other people are thinking, or there's all sorts of different things, and other people sort of learn that it's not yet their time and they've got some particular purpose or job that they're here to do. So often they come back and then life unfolds in such a way that they see there's a whole new bit of life that is yet to be lived. And there are two things that is almost universal that people come back with, and that is both the importance of gaining knowledge about this, about the nature of life and the nature of the universe and the nature of yourself, and the ability to love people in the same way that they were loved by the being of light in the experience. So it was like there was this unconditional love that came down on them. So when people come back from the near-death experience, it's often like life goes through a reorientation. And often people have been very sort of high-powered businessmen, and after the experience they completely stop all that and accumulated masses of wealth no longer seems quite relevant, and they often become things like counsellors or carers or teachers. So it becomes much more to do with how you relate to your fellow humans. So you look at everything very differently. My own sort of feeling about it and reading all this and thinking about it is it sort of makes me realise that life is, on one level, is very precious, and while you're here you have this very limited time to dance your particular dance, and it's so important to do what Joseph Campbell called following your bliss. And by following your bliss he meant following that deep sense of rightness. There are certain things in life, when you do them, you get very illuminated and you feel very alive. And when you do it, it's like you're playing your particular role in the big drama. So you also inspire other people. And for me, because life is so finite, it's so important that you dance your particular dance while you can. It's very easy to be pushed and swayed by other people trying to make you want to do their dance, but it's so important to trust your own instincts and your own intuition and really do well and make a work of art out of your particular life. So I think that's about enough from me.
Thank you.
Any questions? Or
I have experience of person in a car accident with his friend. He went in coma and his friend died. And after 2-3 months, he came back to coma and could talking about what happened to him. And I talked to him directly, and I told what happened to you and during 2-3 months in coma, and he said same thing about something happened to him and he went to like some channel, and then in the end something opened and a huge light appeared to me, he said. And he said his the friend name was Dervish. He said Dervish went to the light, but they didn't let me go.
oh,
And same time said, did Dervish die? Because didn't say he died. They said family said he's in another hospital in another city and is alive. They didn't say he died. But same time when he talked to me and said when we went to that opening door, Dervish went to the light, and same time said, did Dervish die? And another thing, because Dervish died and buried in the same city, but we didn't say him the story. Family, we said he is in hospital, is okay. And once we want to go to the cemetery to Dervish tomb, and we took him with ourselves, but in the car, in parking, he was with me, and the family went to the Dervish tomb to visit. And he said to me, I came with Dervish here. Because never ever he came there. He said, with Dervish I came here. Where is he here? I said, no, Dervish is not here. He's in hospital, he's okay. I said, I don't know why. I came here with Dervish. Yeah, and it was so amazing things.
that's a lovely story. Any more?
Sometimes when people die, there's just after they've died, there's a heavy feeling. When my father died, we were all there, not for his actual death, because we'd gone to bed and he was a private man and he would have wanted to die on his own. But for the rest of that night after he died, and the next day, there was just a heavy feeling. And then when we came back, or each one of us, we came from different areas, we saw this, there was manifest, a huge rainbow. And when we came back into the house, it was free. It was amazing. It was as if he wanted to check everybody was all right.
Well, I can imagine him doing
yes,
that.
absolutely. There's a woman called Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, which people might have heard of, who used to always work with dying people and lots of children. And one of the children who was dying had drawn a rainbow, and he said the rainbow is the bridge between heaven and earth. So beautiful.
It is beautiful. It's very commonly reported, the rainbow in children's NDEs.
Yeah.
There's an interesting thing happens, again, that gives more validity to the NDEs. When people meet the dead relatives, it very often happens that one of the relatives who they meet, they don't know is dead. But when they return from the experience, they realise that the relative had actually died. So they then report they met Auntie so-and-so, and I don't know why I met her because she's still alive, but she'd already died without the patient knowing. And that happens quite a lot.
What about ghosts?
I've never seen a ghost. Have you seen a ghost?
I've seen fleeting shadows and like curtain veils go past and wander. At the corner of my eyes, so I don't know if it's imagination.
I've got no direct experience of ghosts. Anyone?
I was in the spiritualist movement for around 8 years during my 20s, full time, training in clairvoyance for platform mediumship. And during that time, we developed clairsentience, clairaudience, and different ways to view spirit. So during that time, I had a lot of experience of seeing spirit and talking to spirit and things. And within that movement, we refer to a place called the Summerland. And the Summerland is a place where, when spirits want to come down and talk to relatives through a medium or directly to that relative, there'll be a merging down process, and that's the place where they wait. So it's very much like Philip said with the fields, and they wait there and are able to talk through that place. And we also have something called the Hall of Mirrors, where it's the place where you have your life review. Just like Philip said, so.
I quite like the sound of the Summerland.
It sounds like a good place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I could hang out
So
there.
will
be hot.
Is it true that if someone commits suicide, they sort of get stuck in limbo and relive the suicide all over and over again?
Not in the near-death experience account. There's one, my absolute favourite near-deather is a lady called Kelly Sammy, and she hasn't written any books, but she's a lot of her videos on YouTube, and she committed suicide. You know her as well, don't you? Kelly Sammy. Yeah.
Oh, from Nurture.
Yeah.
She's got that. Yes.
Yeah.
Ah.
She committed suicide. She had the full near-death experience, and she almost, for me, she had the most fullest near-death experience of anyone. She goes further than this one, the neuroscientist one, and she came back with the realization. She came back really as a fully realized person from her near-death experience, and
she attempted suicide.
She attempted suicide. She was clinically dead and was resuscitated, but her experience is an amazing one and is worth following up. So I don't know of any experiences of suicides who have committed suicide and had the most horrendous time. Mostly,
An example of that.
yeah.
I've meditated quite a lot with people who have just died, and the first time I did it was actually with my father, and he went to a place of sort of letting go of the experiences of life, and he was happy.